The senator from Tennessee.
Mr. President, I ask consent to call off the quorum call.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. In 2021, President Biden signed Executive Order 14019. This executive order directs federal government agencies to engage in voter mobilization using taxpayer resources, and it requires that they submit a plan for doing so to the White House. This includes helping with completing vote-by-mail materials and finding third-party organizations to conduct voting-related activity on federal property. This executive order prompted questions and concern. First, there's no clear authority in federal law allowing executive branch agencies to work with certain voters to complete mail-in ballot forms and bring in outside organizations to help. And there's no authority for spending congressionally appropriated funds on this activity, raising the question of whether it violates the Anti-Deficiency Act. The same act prohibits federal agencies from accepting voluntary services, which this executive order blatantly violates by directing agencies to solicit third-party organizations to provide voting-related services on agency premises. There's also the question of whether the Biden administration is implementing this executive order in a manner that violates the Hatch Act. The Hatch Act limits political activity by federal employees. The Hatch Act is a federal law that was enacted in the 1930s for the very purpose of preventing this sort of government activity. It was enacted after the Roosevelt administration was accused of using federal employees and the WPA to boost Democrat candidates. Does this sound familiar? Think about VP Harris's recent announcement that federal funds will be used to hire college students as, quote, nonpartisan poll workers this summer. As it turns out, her example that she used was a committed partisan. Back to Executive Order 14019 and the Biden administration's pledge to be, quote, the most transparent presidential administration ever. Surely, the Biden administration is going to go above and beyond to be transparent and explain exactly how this order is being implemented, right? Wrong. In fact, in the 3 years since this order was issued, the Biden administration has done the exact opposite. The White House has stonewalled congressional requests to see the agency plans that are required under the order, despite the fact that congressionally appropriated resources are being spent on these plans. They've gone to court to fight open records requests to see the plans. Last May, along with several colleagues, I wrote to the White House asking for basic information on these plans. I never received a response. We wrote again in November, and again, were ignored by the White House. Now I've introduced legislation that would simply require that the agencies disclose their plans and provide an update on their implementation. That's it. They just have to explain what they're doing. Will they? I'll note that I'm not alone in seeking transparency regarding this executive order. Several of my Democrat colleagues recently wrote the General Services Administration requesting its plan under the same executive order. My legislation simply broadens this request by seeking transparency from all agencies. The White House's continued and deliberate secrecy begs the question, what are they hiding? What do they fear revealing? I think that we can surmise that these plans take our nation right back to the 1930s, weaponizing government yet again, this time to recruit and to harvest Democrat voters. The facts that have slipped out seem to confirm just as much. The Biden White House tasked a far-left organization called Demos, which describes its mission as, quote, pioneering bold, progressive ideas. This organization has been used by the White House to help implement this executive order. Demos recommended this voter mobilization strategy to the incoming Biden administration in December of 2020. Interestingly, Demos's former president was brought into work in the White House, which dutifully issued this order implementing the Demos plan during President Biden's first year in office. The Department of Health and Human Services has acknowledged that it's working with groups like the ACLU and DEMOS to implement this executive order. A FOIA request also revealed that DEMOS is working with the Department of Agriculture. It seems that the idea is to use federal agencies to provide point-of-sale voter mobilization. Provide a federal benefit, and then use that exchange of federal benefits to mobilize the voter. There's a reason why the Hatch Act and other laws prevent federal employees from engaging in political activity. Because federal employees are paid to serve all American taxpayers, not use government benefits to activate voters. This sort of activity is fraught with potential partisan impact, even if it's ostensibly framed as nonpartisan. Setting aside the clear policy and ethical concerns, all my legislation requires is transparency. The Biden administration has taken extraordinary steps to hide this basic information from the American people. Not only does President Biden owe taxpayers this information regarding how their hard-earned dollars are being spent on voter mobilization, but it's a basic duty of this body to oversee how congressionally appropriated funds are being spent, especially on activities for which they were never appropriated. In just a few months, tens of millions of Americans will cast their vote for president. The American people deserve to know whether the incumbent president is attempting to tip the scales in favor of his own reelection using taxpayer dollars. We all agree that free and fair elections are a foundational pillar of the United States. The founders of the United States rightfully left that responsibility of carrying out federal elections to the states, not to the incumbent federal president. This was to help ensure the integrity of and ensure the confidence in our election system. This executive order is an extreme departure from the American model. The president using the vast federal bureaucracy to carry out a secret voter mobilization operation months before the election is a dangerous precedent, and it should alarm every one of us here in Congress, and frankly, it should alarm every American. That's why I'm requesting that the Senate pass legislation requiring that the Biden administration disclose these plans and provide the transparency that's necessary to address rightful concerns about using taxpayer dollars in an unlawful and in a deeply disturbing manner. So, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that, notwithstanding Rule 22, the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of S. 4239, which is at the desk. I further ask that the bill be read a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Reserving the right to object.
The senator from California.
Mr. President, I believe that our democracy works best when as many eligible people as possible participate in our democracy. That's not a controversial stance or a partisan talking point. It's actually the bedrock of our democracy, and something that I assume we all learned in high school civics class. That's why in March of 2021, President Biden issued Executive Order 14019, directing federal agencies to take common sense steps to promote nonpartisan voter registration and participation, including by partnering with state voter registration offices. Voter registration offices, by the way, are recognized and charged by federal law, right? We have the National Voter Motor Law, just as one example, from 1994. I'm very familiar with this because prior to joining the Senate, I served as California Secretary of State, where and so in that lens, from that perspective, I enthusiastically support the administration's efforts to ensure that all eligible Americans are able to participate in our elections. So you see, in the democracy, nobody should be afraid of encouraging more eligible Americans to register to vote and to cast their ballot. Nobody should be afraid of increasing turnout. Certainly not United States senators. But at the same time, I also strongly support Congress's oversight role. That's why I've already engaged in conversations with the administration on the steps that they're taking to implement the executive order and help more eligible Americans vote. Because that's what this straightforward executive order does. It simply directs federal agencies to take appropriate steps, mindful of the law, within their existing authorities, not asking them to do anything they haven't done before, to help eligible Americans to vote. Nowhere in the order does it say help Democrats or help Republicans or help anyone else, any eligible American. So, if my colleague is interested in joining me to receive these updates from the administration on their implementation, I'd be more than happy to facilitate such a meeting and conversation. But this bill, colleagues, the bill before us now is simply the latest Republican attempt to undermine the Biden administration's efforts to expanding voting to all eligible Americans. Earlier this year, I voted alongside my Democratic colleagues against efforts that would have blocked funding to implement this executive order. And I'll continue to work with my colleagues to protect the right to vote and efforts to promote voter access. And again, I'm more than happy to work with my colleague, any of my colleagues, to have productive conversations with the administration. But this bill will only serve to undermine the work being done to promote voter registration and participation. So therefore, Mr. President, I object.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President,
Senator from Tennessee.
I appreciate my colleague, Senator Padilla's outreach to work together, and I look forward to working with him on a number of issues in this regard. He has great expertise in this arena. But I have a very basic question to ask, and that is, what is this administration afraid of? Because all I'm asking for is transparency. I'm just asking to see the plans that are commanded by this executive order, yet the administration stonewalls us on this. We talk about having conversations, but why not just show the plans? I fear that this is a return back to the 1930s, a return back to the weaponization of government, delivering a point-of-sale benefit, and at the same time, bringing along a voter registration package and an encouragement of voting for the incumbent administration. Let's see the plans. Let's allay the concerns that I raise. This administration is not doing that. This administration is stonewalling us. In fact, my colleague, Senator Padilla, has also requested transparency of the GSA to find out what they're doing with respect to implementing this executive order. Let's expand this to all agencies. Let's let the American public see what the Biden administration is up to with this executive order. But the real motivation of this executive order was the fact that the Biden administration was disappointed that they weren't able to federalize our election system. After the failure of H.R. 1 and S1 here in the Senate, this is the result, Executive Order 14019. This is the command to weaponize the federal system for electioneering activities. I think Americans deserve to see what these plans are, and I would look forward to the transparency that I'm asking for. Thank you, Mr. President.